I'm Robert Moscow of Coalition to Protect Mountain Burial Sites. I also have my own private conservation practice, Moscow Cemetery Monument Services, and we are going to demonstrate how to do an assessment and condition assessment of an historical cemetery today. In case you're not familiar with the Coalition to Protect Mountain Burial Sites, it is an organization totally dedicated to the protection and preservation of Maryland burial sites. That being said, we've got to assess the St. Thomas Episcopal Church Cemetery. This cemetery is it's a churchyard cemetery. It dates back to 1729. It's about 2 acres. There's 21 points in assessing a cemetery, and some of them you want to do beforehand. It's essentially it's like homework, so to speak, and that is your history and background of the cemetery that you're about to assess. How old is it? What has anything significance occurred? People of significance buried there, and so forth. You obviously want the address and location, and you want its current status. And what we mean by that is it's still taking active interments. Now, in the case of this site, yes, it is taking active interments, but in the more modern developed section where it expanded to. As for the churchyard here itself, no, not so much. Of course, you want to identify the cemetery type. Now, when I first started practicing back in '91, there was about, I would say, roughly 10 different types of cemeteries that were on the books. Well, now that's extended to about 13, with the ones that are now going green and the other types of burial practices that they're utilizing today. But this type of cemetery is what we would identify as a churchyard type cemetery because it surrounds a church and it's enclosed by a stone wall. And there's a reason for that, which will be reflected in the assessment report when we're finished. We're also going to record the cemetery layout. And there's certain types of software out there that will allow you to look at sites via satellite view that can help you determine this ahead of time. And the layout is very significant because, one, it will help explain and depict the development of the site, but from a conservator's perspective, it'll allow you to understand what kind of access you have, and if it's going to present any challenges for getting in certain equipment in and out of the site. You're going to record the cemetery size. How big is it? Because obviously the size is going to determine how long you're going to be spending out in the field, as well as the number of graves that you can anticipate being there. And this information is very essential for any type of cemetery, especially the ones that has suffered deferred maintenance for many years, because most of your graves would probably be, or your gravestones, the hardscape, would be either sunken or fallen over or buried in the ground, and you wouldn't know just how many graves to expect. So by understanding the size can give you an idea just how many marked graves you would expect to find in it. Access and security, that's also important to know, not just from the cemetery security perspective, but also yours. Is there somebody that you got to notify to gain access to the site? And then how difficult is it? We have 4 access ways into the site, to the stone wall. Some are wider than others. The main entrance, which was built back when they had horse and buggy, is just wide enough that a Kubota could fit through. And that's about as only access you're going to have with any type of motorized equipment, other than going to the smaller entrances, which you have to go in by foot. We're going to also assess the terrain, and this is just to determine just how hilly or uneven it is. Now, we expect to find, of course, your subsidence in the cemetery of this age, so we're going to find the ground's going to be uneven, but we're also going to know is how steep is it, because that's also going to have a bearing on how we're going to access equipment, and if certain equipment could even be accessed into the site. And then after you obtain all this information, you're going to do what's called the initial visual assessment. And this is where you're going to go in, and not so necessarily methodologically you do this, but you go in and just do a general walkthrough to the site. Get an overall look at it, get a feel for it, see what conditions stand out, what type of objects stand out. And in this case, for this cemetery, we have two structures that stand out, and that is the church itself, which was built back in the early 1700s, and we're looking at the R.H. Mole mausoleum, which is right outside the front door with an iron gate around it. So that stands out. And then after you've done that and you've documented things of note, you're then going to select a methodology. And when we say methodology, we mean a system in which you're going to assess. Now, most people will prefer to do this with a map, but not all cemeteries have that. And though they're interested, they are afraid of often the cost. Again, contact the Coalition of Protecting Memorial Sites. You'll be surprised just how inexpensive and just how much of the mapping process you can do yourself. That will save you a considerable amount of money, and leave the rest for the professional to do, to create a cemetery map. So in selecting a methodology, you kind of want to do it along with the layout, but you want to do it in a pattern that can be easily followed. And that means starting at one corner of the site and moving in one direction, row by row, stone by stone, until each and every burial site has been thoroughly assessed. Your basic tools of the trade for this, you can use a form if you want. For me and for what I'm doing, I prefer to use a voice recorder because I would be doing a lot of writing and my hand would be tired and it would slow things up. So I would verbally record into a handheld voice recorder, and then I would also have with me a digital camera. You can never, when doing a cemetery assessment, I can stress this, you can never have too many pictures. Now, I will tell you it will be tedious and time consuming after assessment's done sorting those photos out. However, it will keep you from having to constantly return to the site over and over again. Now, usually when doing an assessment, you're going to have to return to the site at least a second time. I don't care how thorough you are, how experienced you are, there's always going to be something you've missed, overlooked, didn't see, or you just didn't get the right angle for that condition. And then usually you don't encounter that until you're actually starting to write your report. So be prepared for a second visit in most cases. So you're going to pick your methodology, and in your report you're going to explain your methodology. You're going to explain the pattern in which you traveled so that others can follow it, and in some cases a map can be created to trace your steps in order to find the stones that you did, because you're not going to take the time at this point to try and attempt to record every single stone while you're doing the assessment. You never get done, number one. Number two, not all stones could necessarily be read because it's on the ground. And secondly, because of biological growth of some, you couldn't read them. So that means you'd have to bring in cleaning equipment, lifting equipment, gloves, and essentially this particular site would on average take you about 2 hours to assess. After you selected your methodology and explain that, you are then going to document the types of markers you see. And when I see types, we mean what types of stones do we have in this cemetery. This particular one, we've got some marble, we've got some granite, we've got some metabasalt, we've got some bluestone, which we'll look at later on. And then we're going to go to the styles of stones, and that's also essential to know. We've got in this particular site some simple tablets upon tiers of bases, tablets on bases, box tombs, ledgers, sarcophagus, burial vaults, almost every type, variety of stone from the early 1700s all the way up to the modern time. We're going to identify grave groupings, and that is essential in determining different families and why these stones are grouped the way they're grouped. And in this case, you can see right where we're standing, we got some copings here with some similar matching markers. So that determines that this is a particular family that's buried in these particular plots. And that has also helped to distinguish family plots from general plots. And in some cases, it will also help prioritize the work, because some churches or some cemeteries prefer that they go by a particular family first that's in various worse condition than others. But that's just a preference thing, and that's up to the conservator to determine. We're also going to determine the approximate number of graves. And again, that's nice to know. Well, it's important from the conservator's perspective, because it's going to tell you just about how much work you can expect that needs to be done in the site. And also help determine if there's going to be any missing stones at all. And that will only apply to your abandoned cemeteries, ones that have suffered deferred maintenance for 100 some years, versus ones that are regularly maintained like this one here. And again, there may not be any missing stones, but to understand the burial practice, early burial practices, and the use of space, that will certainly give you an idea or give you something to look at, just to make sure they're not overlooked. And of course, if there is a suspicion of missing stones or sunken stones, and we can't find them, or we've got remnants of them, but you still think there might be a burial site there, then ground penetrating radar, the next step of assessment, can be brought in to help determine that. Or an archaeologist, University of Maryland, who I've worked with quite a bit, they're always looking for a project to do, and they're perfect for coming into cemeteries and doing a dig and determining if there's an actual burial versus just a terrain feature that got eroded away. You're going to assess maintenance. Everyone seems to think that vandalism is the #1 cause of cemetery maintenance, and though it is on a sporadic basis, but maintenance is done on a regular basis. And with that being said, maintenance is your #1 cause of damage within a cemetery, and we're going to take note of any maintenance damage that we see. Now, obviously, some stones you can see are obviously been scraped, but if we can evaluate and assess the level of maintenance damage, we can certainly assess the livelihood or the chances of any stones that need a repair being struck again. So if you can determine that there's aggressive maintenance being undertaken right off the bat, then you can certainly say it's not going to be cost effective to repair a broken stone if it's vulnerable to being knocked into by a maintenance crew. So in this case, you'd want to have the maintenance crew addressed before any time and money is invested into repairing and resetting any broken stones. We're going to assess the vegetation, what type of vegetation is contained within the site, and that's just as significant as the hardscape, because your grass, for example, contained in the cemetery, that very well could be the same grass that was there when that cemetery was first founded, and that's significant in itself. There is approximately 10 different types of vegetation that you can find within a Maryland cemetery at any given time. Now, I'm not going to find all of it, but at least 1 out of 10 types of vegetation you will find within a Maryland cemetery that is intended to be there, should be allowed to remain there and thrive there, and has and holds a significance of some type to the cemetery. And then we're going to identify the conditions found, and that is your stones that are leaning and tilted, stones that are unstable, stones that are fallen over, so on and so forth. All that's going to get tallied up. That is the information that your cemeterians, your administrative bodies, generally want to know, and that's what they're most after and most interested in. However, maintenance from a conservator's perspective should come before that, and then there's the cause for these conditions that they need to be made aware of prior to addressing anything, because I've had many projects where we've went ahead and assess the conditions, tied them up, and, well, when can we start fixing these? Well, can we address the causes first? And you get that deer in the headlight look. There's no point in fixing something if you can easily identify the cause and address it and lessen the chance of happening again, versus go ahead and fixing it and going around that continuous circle of repairing it. We're going to want to record the inscription and language styles and dates. That's significant in regards to the history of the site, especially in areas where you had German settlers, Jewish settlers. That holds a world of information regarding the area. Hazards that threaten the cemetery. Usually the hazards I've seen have been aggressive maintenance, the landscape, the trees contained within it, and then just the overall ignorance. And I don't mean this in a mean way, but just the overall not knowing ignorance of the administration of the cemetery itself. They have good intentions, but just don't know any better. And then there's any other remarkable conditions or issues that are not ordinarily seen. In this case of this site, the only thing that I see out of the ordinary that you don't see in most is an African American cemetery buried outside, I want to say, the west wall of the site.
The end result should be a printed and bound cemetery assessment report that you will deliver to the client. The cemetery board will then review your recommendations and select a course of action that fits within their budget.